Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. This is our quarter in review show where we go over the top 3 stories for the quarter and give our wins, fails, and predictions. And to help me for Q4 2023 is Danielle Jablanski. Welcome to the show, Danielle.
Thanks, Dale. Thanks for having me.
Well, we'll give you a little bit of a bio here, but I think most people probably know you. Danielle is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and an OT cybersecurity strategist with Nozomi Networks. So where does this podcast find you? Where are you today?
So I'm in Arlington, Texas. I usually say Dallas because folks assume Virginia, but Arlington, Texas, and I'm actually at a co-working space at the old Rangers Stadium. So go Rangers. That was a great win this year.
Is that your home office there? Is that where you're usually at, or are you just visiting?
I have a co-working, membership here, but I live about a half a mile from here. So,
oh wow,
I like to switch it up a little bit. Yeah.
And now, maybe the most important question for the whole show is for those. I guess it's a big deal in the United States. I don't know if it's a big deal around the world, but these kind of Christmas sweaters that tend to be kind of on the ugly side. Some people call them ugly Christmas sweaters. They could be called festive Christmas sweaters. Yes. I've seen numerous pictures of Nozomi employees wearing that blue Nozomi Christmas sweater.
I wore mine
Did you manage to get one of those?
I wore it yesterday. That's funny.
Oh, okay.
And my boss, who's new to Nozomi, is like, where do I get one of these? And he's going to reach out to HR, but they were actually an unsanctioned print.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, they're very funny. I mean, they're perfect Christmas sweaters, and I was almost wondering if I was going to see it on the show here, but
they're popular. If you want one, I know a guy. So
I couldn't pull it off. I think Andrea and a couple of others I've seen can pull it off, but I don't think I can. Well, as people come on board here, welcome to the show. We will take your comments and questions. If you're on LinkedIn or YouTube watching this live, feel free to enter these in, and Danielle and I can see them, and Liz will post them up if they're applicable. So we'd encourage you to get involved. But with that as an intro, let's dive into our first story, which I think, in my mind, is a clear lead story for the quarter, and that was the SEC charges against SolarWinds and their CISO, now CISO, I think he was a VP at the time, Tim Brown. And they charged them with securities fraud. There were actually 10 different counts of security fraud. I think the pull quote was, they defrauded SolarWinds investors and customers through misstatements, omissions, and schemes that concealed both the company's poor cybersecurity practices and its heightened and increasing cybersecurity risks. So this is a broad canvas. I'm going to kind of throw you a broad question, Danielle. I'm sure you've been watching this, talking to a lot of people about this. What are at least one or two of your thoughts on this securities fraud charge on SolarWinds and Tim?
Well, first of all, I think anything that makes a CISO's job harder sucks. I know that that's not a professional term, but it does. It sucks to make anyone's security job harder at the end of the day. For me, the pull quotes were, on a broad perspective, was the bit around transparency and accountability. That really does matter, right? So we can't discredit that whatsoever. But the glaring detail for me was the fact that other customers had asked, is this happening elsewhere? Are you aware of it? And consistently the answer was no. So it's one thing to say, here's our policy and procedures, and we're not following those, and that's bad. But where it comes to people asking, have you experienced this before, and can we get some help? And the answer being a flat out, no, we haven't seen it. This is our first knowledge of it. That for me was the big miss on how you handle any kind of incident, whether it's big or small.
Well, let's stay on the security side of it, the cybersecurity side of it, as well, as opposed to the SEC use of security, the Securities Exchange Commission, the security as a stock. It was interesting. They had quotes from insiders. So you had, for example, InfoSec employee F, saying that he lied about something. I think that was one of the examples you gave. Someone asked him, did it happen before? He said no, and then he said, well, I just lied in his mind. So I saw that as well. But they highlighted 4 different areas where the security controls, the SEC did, where the security controls failed. One was the SDL was not followed, password policy not followed, access control policy not followed, and they said they were doing the NIST CSF and they weren't. What did you think about those four? Did the evidence that was in the SEC claim, did that appear to you to be enough to say they weren't doing the job on those four?
So I'm not sure about all four, but I was most curious about the CSF, right? Because there's no perfect mapping or check boxes. So how do you really evaluate that quote unquote standard? Because it's a voluntary framework. So that one to me seemed the most of a stretch, just because it's hard to diligently say yes or no, right? This is conforming or not conforming to something so broad. If it were 6443, it'd be a little bit more specific. To me, the bigger issue were that there were known risks. And then I thought it was interesting that SEC said that those known cybersecurity risks were not presented independently from other risks. I actually thought that was a little caveat that we haven't seen a lot of discussion around, because that's also not really normal, right? You don't see boards saying, I want to hear about this risk separate to other risk. We actually do see it as part of a broader picture. We talk about holistic risk management, holistic this, holistic that, making sure cyber is not the last conversation in the board meeting, but we've never seen it kind of underscored as its separate thing. I do think, password policies, not attesting to your actual practices, apparently is probably more rampant than we think. So back to this, what you put publicly out there being what you're going to be held to, I think that's a good, precedent to set in my mind. So good and bad, but.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I actually had them ranked in that order. And the NIST CSF was the lowest to me because it's not really a set of requirements. Yeah. It's a set of, here are areas that you need to consider, and you can decide which set of controls need to be met. So the fact that they weren't meeting all of 800-53, they tied that in. To me, that's apples and oranges.
Yeah.
853 are possible security controls to meet various categories and subcategories in the NIST CSF. So I don't really think that one, right. I'd feel pretty good defending that one in court.
And the security by design, the entire premise is back to that transparency and accountability. And that's all about, say what you do, what you say, and say what you're going to do. I also hope that this emphasis on the CSF doesn't then detract other companies from using that resource, because it is so popular. They've just, they're just about to finish the 2.0. And you have to always think about the adverse consequences of holding somebody to the standard that doesn't yet exist, and creating that fallacy that now companies don't want to say that they're working on the CSF if they're going to be somehow, retroactively verifying or enforcing this voluntary standard.
Yep. Yeah. And to me, the SDL was the one that was most damning. Yeah. The security development life cycle, because that's one of those cases where especially since they are developing products, and they say, this is how we ensure security in our development process. Yeah. So they documented their process, and then they didn't follow it repeatedly. So that one, I think, and then there were weaknesses in the product, probably as a result, or certainly you could make the argument as a result of not following it. That one, I think, would be very tough. Password policy was what I had second. The access control policy not being followed, I thought that evidence was a little weak. Yeah. Because they said, for example, there were a lot of admins. Well, sometimes if you're developing things, you need administrative rights. So I think that one would be a little more wishy-washy. But I think a lot of what they're going to run into is they said, this is what we're going to do, and then they didn't do it.
I agree. And I think the SDL is downright damning. I mean, if you're a software company, that's one thing. If you're a security software company, then your standards have to be higher. That's the requirement. That's what we see in the new national cybersecurity strategy. That's what we see across Europe. And at a certain point, I think it's going to actually begin to price companies out of business, because the rush to deliver products has been the driving factor. And now we're seeing groups like the SEC, but other agencies as well, saying, that's not good enough. If you are promising something and making false claims in a security software company, and we find out about it, and then we have blatant evidence of things being covered up, essentially, there should be some consequences for that. Now, whether or not those consequences should be levied at an individual, that's a whole different conversation, rather than the business and the liability issues. I'm no expert there. But I do think that all of the points of contention are warranted for investigation, right? Even if, like you said, there's not good evidence for all of them. I think that they all warranted investigation.
Yeah. And the thing that worries me a little bit about this, and we're still talking about cybersecurity. We're not talking about stocks as securities, is especially with the insiders, you had people writing things in emails and various presentations being made. And if you're saying we can't have anything documented that could make us look bad, I mean, you're going to have, you probably know, there's some wild cards out there in the security world. Some people might even say I am sometimes, but I'm not working in one of these companies. I'm more kind of on my own. But if you are in this group and you've got this security professional who doesn't think you're doing enough, and he writes this email or she writes this email saying we should be doing this, this, and this, and it doesn't get addressed, now does every single communication that goes on internally have to go through a formal process and be addressed, or you could be found lacking in your diligence or your communications with the public because you didn't say what this person said, or you didn't internally investigate it and go through and refute it. To me, some of the examples they gave were very worrying in that sense.
Yeah, a bit of a witch hunt, right? It could turn into.
It could, and also it could really cut down on communications.
Right. Well, I think we also have to remember,
arguing these things.
Go ahead. I think we have to also remember that there's a QA process separate, right? So, in the development life cycle, there's always some type of quality control, and you might be able to absolve some of that into your quality control process to alleviate that concern, where you might just have people saying it's not enough, it's not enough. You also have the other wild card where people are saying, don't worry about it. Put it out there. We don't have to, other than what we say we have to do, we don't actually have to worry about that. It can be something we address later on. If it's not broken, don't fix it. If we don't know about a vulnerability, don't look into it. If we don't have a disclosure policy, right? Some of those kind of red flags for companies also still exist. So there's always both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah. Yep. Well, if you're watching here on LinkedIn or YouTube, feel free to comment on what you thought of the cybersecurity ramifications of the SEC case. I will note, and I'll put it in the show notes, Tim Brown spoke at, I think it was S422, and it was a very well-received presentation. He was quite candid about things they got right, how they investigated. There was a really interesting section in his speech on why he didn't get fired. And it was kind of that the internal team looked at what the new candidate said they would do and what he said he would do, and it was the same. So they stuck with him. So there was an interesting speech. I doubt you'll get him on many stages in the near future. He's probably hunkering down on this. Any other thoughts on the cybersecurity ramifications of this before we go to the securities, the SEC stock ramifications?
I think it further muddies the water on what companies should do to be doing well. It's one thing, again, to state certain things as fact and then not being, not following through on things you're saying you're doing. But then there's this other confusion around what does good look like? When is enough, and how do I categorize that and capture that for my stakeholders and for everyone else? And I don't think there's a good answer out there. And so if you pull out all the details, there's obviously, like I said, a case for investigating bad practices and, some ignorance, to be honest. If you know something's wrong and you're not addressing it, that's on you. But I also think that back to this conversation of what is a baseline, what is a best practice, there's always a school of thought behind what's recommended to you or who becomes your champion for something. But that school of thought is different for whoever you ask. And I think that's a problem. It's a challenge. Do I follow the CSF or do I not follow the CSF? Do I follow something else or do I not follow something else? Are my, requirements in Europe going to hamper my development in the US or vice versa, right? It's a difficult challenge now that things are getting more complex across the regulatory landscape. So I don't think that it helps that confusion.
Okay. I'd agree with that. The funny thing about this, and what's actually worried me, is that we've had a lot of comments from people like you and I and others in the cybersecurity world about what this means in terms of SEC regulations. And quite frankly, that's very different than cybersecurity regulations. It's almost like if you or I were commenting on tort law or something like that. I don't think this community really understands that well enough to be talking about what's going to happen with the SEC. That's one of the reasons why for S4 this year, I wanted to get a lawyer down there. So I'm going to be interviewing Stuart Baker. He's the host of the Cyber Law podcast. He's with Steptoe and Johnson. He's like a Washington lawyer institution. And originally I was going to have him talk about the government's efforts on software liability that you saw in the strategic plan. And we'll still cover that, but I'm really curious to see what he has to say on these SEC rules. But let me just dive into that a little bit more. One of my favorite people to follow when it talks about securities and finance and rules and regulations is Matt Levine of Bloomberg. And he has this riff on securities fraud. And I'll just quote it here. He says, "My non-technical theory is that everything is securities fraud. If a public company does a bad thing or a bad thing happens to it and the stock drops, then that is securities fraud. The stock was high because the investors did not know about the company's vulnerability to the bad thing. Then the bad thing happened. Investors found out and the stock dropped. Before they found out, they were deceived about the true value of the company, so that was fraud. Here, that is all you need to know. Bad thing, stock down, securities fraud." And it's funny because he actually had an article on the SolarWinds case, but he does this securities fraud riff across almost everything, almost every aspect. Like anytime the stock goes down, you see a securities fraud case. So I'm wondering whether, like when I look at companies, you've probably seen this. You've been in many companies seeing their security programs. There are many, many things wrong with security programs, whether they be asset owners who are public companies, whether they be vendors creating ICS security equipment. I mean, we could go into Siemens or Rockwell or any of these companies and find many, many problems with their systems that have been known for a long time. I mean, the Siemens PLC is kind of legendary for having problems that have been known since Stuxnet, not fixed. So I almost wonder if this is just a case where you're going to be okay until the stock goes down. Before you comment on that, one other thing that came out that was really interesting this week was there was a 4-page letter related that was the SEC's comments and then SolarWinds Tim Brown's comment. And SolarWinds' response was, "The SEC is inappropriately seeking through this case to position itself as a cybersecurity regulator for public companies, a role for which it lacks congressional authority or substantive expertise. SolarWinds has long disclosed in its public findings that it is at risk of cyber attack. Well before Sunburst, its SEC filings warn that its systems are vulnerable to compromise, including by sophisticated nation-state attackers in security breaches that may remain undetected for an extended period." So when you actually get into the security side of this, it is not a question of whether their cybersecurity was good enough. It is whether their disclosure is good enough. And I think that's something that I'm really interested to watch and hear what Stuart and others say. I think that's going to really drive this case. And we could even run into cases where all this does is change disclosure language, but has minimal impact on actual company action. Yeah. So it's something I'm watching very closely. I don't know if you've been looking at the security side of this.
A little bit. There was so much in everything you just proposed and put forward, but it's interesting to me because if you look at attacks and threat actors, they target commodities, they target money. And if you mess with the money, things get ugly. And that's exactly what we're seeing for the SEC. So I don't think it's an overreach in their, regulatory authority. I also love to remind people in a lot of the talks and writing that I do that cybersecurity is an unregulated industry. I can tell you anything's in the product and you have to verify it independently, right? I think what's more detrimental is what we said about people now thinking, well, if I'm going to be scrutinized over the CSF, I'm not going to say that I'm doing the CSF. I'm not going to adopt it. And that's a net negative for security. Now to the everything being security fraud, that goes above my pay grade, but I think that's what cyber insurance is looking at, right? Like, do we have good enough data to make these decisions? And if not, are we doing a disservice and kind of lumping things together at that financial level? But again, if you talk to security practitioners, the only time something changes is if it affects the bottom line. So to a certain extent, you have to mess with the money, the revenue, the regulatory body, the ability to find the compliance mechanism, whatever industry you're in. But security companies are held to a different degree. It's not just your average software or tool out there on the market. It is somebody saying we're doing security, and then we're not even following our own security guidelines, right? That is a net negative again across the board for an unregulated market. So it can't be a world in which you can say whatever you want and do something else right behind the scenes. And I think that's exactly what the SEC was created for in the business world. So we can't have our cake and eat it too in that sense. Either we want some review of how these practices are done in the business world, and we want to hold security companies to the standard of security, or we throw it all out and we say, do whatever you want.
Well, but you're not required as far as what I'm reading to do anything in terms of cybersecurity.
No.
To not run afoul of the SEC.
You're right. Well, then don't put it on your website. Right.
Yeah, there is some of that. And there wasn't that deep down in their documentation, they have SEC has statutory right to investigate internal accounting controls. And that was interpreted to cover cybersecurity controls. So it'll be a really interesting case whether they have the authority to do this. They have broad authority with disclosure. What happens more often than not, it appears just from my reading of these cases, is that there's a settlement. So you don't want to mess with the SEC generally, so it would not be surprising that at the end of the day they reach some sort of settlement. But then how this eventually affects other companies' disclosures is going to be very interesting, because again, you go into these companies, you find many issues that are unaddressed, or even the companies that I think are doing well. If I go in and I say, here are the things you should do in priority order, because you can only do so many so fast, right? Well, let's say they're only going to accomplish the first 3 in the next 2 years. Do they have to disclose that they haven't done the other 7? Or are they at risk? To me, this disclosure thing is going to be fascinating to see what happens.
So that combined with the update to Rule 17 for the SEC, I think will be really interesting. We've already seen some filings, actually. Somebody at Nozomi was looking through them recently. But again, back to that disclosure, I think this case, as well as the new update to Rule 17, will both alter disclosure. And I see one of the comments that, Liz hasn't put it up, but it is, do you think that these statements will get more vague? I hope not, because of Rule 17. So now you have this kind of dichotomy of the two incidents coming together on December 15th, so Friday. And we've actually already
Rule
seen
17
OT in those.
Is Rule 17 disclosing something material happening due to a cybersecurity incident?
Yes, but it goes further than that. Some of the language around that has come out of legal frameworks has said that the disclosure should also include consideration of harm to reputation, which is obvious in the SEC legislation recently, customer vendor relationships, competitiveness, possibility of litigation, and regulatory investigations or action by U.S. or non-U.S. authorities. So that already breaks out of this, just cybersecurity perspective of what you say you're doing and what you're not doing, what you investigate, what kind of records and receipts you keep internally or externally. So I think it'll be interesting to see. But I think because of Rule 17, people are going to want to be more forthcoming about the reality of their organization, whether that's good or bad or ugly. There's going to be more transparency there because it's required now.
Yeah, Liz, put up that next comment, because that's related to the rule Daniel's talking about, and there is a requirement on how you have to talk about cyber risk management in some of your SEC filings, right, as well. It's worth watching. I think the Clorox episode was very instructive as a precursor of this rule being in effect, and they handled it in a way that maybe is less valuable to the world and more safe for Clorox. They announced something was wrong. They announced they had an incident. They waited a while before they determined it was material, and then they announced it was material. But the amount of information that was actually published on it was very minimal, compared to other things, compared to some of the other people that have been praised for being very forthright about what was happening and what was being responded. They said, no, we're just going to meet our requirements for our shareholders and keep it at that. So we'll have to see how this actually
and the language for
affects
that timing of determination for materiality says without unreasonable delay. So very opaque language and what is or is not a reasonable delay. MGM moved really fast too, on not their disclosure, but their discernment around materiality. Maybe it was a little bit more obvious in that incident. But I just wanted to be clear that it's not just about the cybersecurity component now. It's connecting it to the rest of the business for those disclosures, and that operational risk that we like to talk about is now kind of I think it's the top decision factor around materiality is operational risk rather than solely financial risk or reputation risk, right? These kind of isolated silos of risk that we've thought about for years.
Well, the materiality, the reporting material events is nothing new. So in effect, you always had to do this.
Right.
This
is very tied to finances, right?
No, I don't think so. I mean, reputation, everything's tied to finances. So if your reputation is affected, but your stock price doesn't go down, I mean, the SEC is there to protect investors,
right?
To provide the investors with the information needed so that they're not fooled. And that's kind of what that Matt Levine thing said, is that if nothing bad happened to SolarWinds stock, we probably wouldn't be talking about them.
Yeah.
Right. We've seen many, many breaches where it's just a blip in the stock.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think reputational risk is this weird assumption in cyber risk that's never really held true. It's all about how you respond to something, not about the something, typically, from what I've seen. But again, the fact that there are emails, with people assigned to them saying we didn't do what we said we were going to do. That's right. the nail in the coffin, or whatever analogy you want to use. But it always goes back to the purse in a realistic market.
Okay, well, stay tuned and we'll put it out if you're not able to attend S4, but I'm really curious. We'll have more information. The case will be further along in March, and to hear what Stuart Baker has to say about it. But we'll be watching this. Now, the next, our second topic is one that's going to be a lot shorter, because in the pre-call or the pre-event discussions, Daniel and I both admitted we're not experts in this area, and that is the Europe Cyber Resilience Act. The EU institutions at the beginning of December reached provisional agreement on the Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA. And it still needs to be formally approved by the European Parliament and Council, and it's possible there could be changes along the way. But the expectation is that early in 24, the first half of 2024, the CRA will be approved. And then there's a 36-month transition period when you have to actually meet that. There's a few things that have to be met at a sooner time. But I guess, Danielle, I'm not an expert at this, and I was hoping you were, but you're also in America. I think we need Europeans for this. Have you figured out yet what CRA will mean for Nozomi?
No, I thought a lot of things were really interesting. I did some research on this, and it said that 70% of Europe's software market is going to be impacted by this. And I think personally that the 24-hour, from exploitation or from wherewithal, as I like to say, is a little bit bananas. Again, that's not a technical term, but 24 hours is going to be rough for anyone. I think the impact on innovation and development is going to be really stark. The fines are really steep. I think I saw like 15 million or some type of proportion to revenue and overall. But I think broadly in the solutions market, it's going to also impact the centralized security market for those that do IoT security or even certificate signing, right? For a long time, there's been this whole push around a solution that says, we can't do device level security, so we need to do some type of centralized orchestration of that security, right? So I don't want to name any companies, but they're definitely out there. That's not what Nozomi does, right? We still focus on the network, and we partner with the companies that do that security orchestration of devices or nodes on the network. But I am kind of interested to see what this means for companies. I think it could price companies out of the market. It's obviously going to incentivize more patching and more development at the vendor level. And then also, I think it was really interesting that there was such a pushback from the open source community that now open source is not included. And so you actually might see companies more willingly adopting open source, and that comes with its own risks, right? So if you're pushing folks more to using open source software, is that due diligence in its own right? I'm not sure. A lot of open questions from this one for me. And then the last one I think is interesting is, back to what does enough look like? How do you always, it's a minimum of 5 years, I think, for the life cycle.
Yep.
Again, how do you then focus on innovation if you're constantly looking at patching? And then what role does the rest of the security solution market look like if that's the only onus at that point is on the manufacturer? It's a really difficult one. I think it's a stretch to be really blunt.
Yeah, there was a lot to it. I've heard some people say it's going to require SBOMs. There's a variety of risk assessment things, a lot on vulnerability reporting and remediation. Lots of parts to this. And I really need to identify. I've talked to some people in the governments on this. I'm kind of looking for an external thought leader on this. So if any of our audience knows of any, definitely send me an email, s4@digitalbond.com. I'd like to dive deeper into this. I would say at this point, what we can say with some level of confidence is it looks like this is going to happen.
Yep.
It is moving forward. It cleared a major hurdle. This was a big hurdle it cleared. And if you do business in Europe, especially if you are providing product in Europe, this is something to get all over because it is a good chance it will affect you. Yeah. I know most of our audience is U.S., but some of them are U.S. companies that sell into Europe, so that would be a big issue for them.
Yeah, I'm very pro mandated disclosures, but definitely not at the risk of economic burden. I think prompting better security to avoid adverse outcomes is great. There's a mention in there of working with ANISA and CSERTs. That's great. But at the tail end of it, there was also some pushback around surveillance because of the national security concerns of the fact that within 24 hours, the government might have a stockpile of vulnerabilities. And if you don't trust your government to that degree, we have other work to do, right? That's pretty glaring. I actually had a different read on that. There's the national security exemption. I think that could be easily abused. So there's a lot of baggage that comes with how you interpret this legislation, I think.
Well, and it was funny. It just came out. I think yesterday. There was some FBI guidance on how you can get a national security exemption of reporting to the SEC for this new Rule 17, and it's like the same sort of thing. It's
yeah. Who do you know, right?
Yeah. I don't know. That's strange things. Although I'm not sure. It'll be interesting to see how companies handle that. Whether they just rather deal with the SEC or the FBI. I'm not sure which is easier or harder.
And then version control, like. Say you are working on a release or an update, if you have to then build in every single contingency or review or update, right? If you're working on patching, you're never going to get a new release out. So that stalls innovation just in how you do your rollouts in your life cycle, right? You might then have to be every 5 years. If you're having to do 5 years, that might be your new standard. And that's not a good standard for software. So that sets us back, right? Always trade-offs.
Yeah, the 5 years is troubling, especially in a DevOps world. Right. It seems to be fighting the trend. Now, we know in the OT world, people talk about life cycles in decades. So that's probably less of an impact for us today.
Yeah.
But in the DevOps world, you want to just force people to upgrade and do it quickly. You don't want them living on 5-year-old code.
It goes back to like prioritization, which is so difficult across the disclosures we see from CISA, et cetera, the products that we look at in the market. Like I won't get into any of that competitive intel, but that's the number one thing that people want to understand is how do I prioritize risks and vulnerabilities, not how do I, cover every single potential issue, right? I don't have the resources for that. I think that goes back to the SEC conversation as well, right? How do I prioritize things that I know need to be addressed? And then to the best of my ability and accountability within my company and my resources, address those in a prioritized way. That's the incentive I think we need to build in. And I think blanket mandates completely ignore that incentive. And that's, again, detrimental.
Okay, great. Now our third story is, and I may butcher how this is pronounced, but Aliquippa water. Sorry to the good people of Aliquippa if I
Pennsylvania.
mispronounced that. But this quarter, an Iranian hacker group, Cyber Avengers, seized control of a booster station that monitors and regulates pressure for Raccoon and Potter townships by hacking an internet-accessible Unitronics PLC. Aliquippa Water has 6,615 customers or households. So probably more than that many people, let's say about 10,000 people. And there was no impact to the drinkable water. It was delivered, it was drinkable, no impact at all. Now, to me, this did not make the top 3 story list because of the attack technique, the attacker, or the impact. For me, this is a big 3 story because of the hysteria. But let me get your view on that. Do you think this is, Danielle, do you agree or disagree with that? Is this a big story because of the attack, the attacker, or the impact?
So I think it's a big miss. I already made a joke about the good, the bad, and the ugly, but really this story has all 3 of those. This was the perfect example for our industry on awareness raising. We know water is important. We know why it's important. We know that, challenging the integrity of water systems can make the difference between boiling your water or evacuating your city. And instead, we chose to make it, and not we, I mean, certain folks chose to make it a really hot button issue around focusing on a specific vendor, right? Or focusing on the glaring security password, default password problem. But at the end of the day, we see more of these accidental, mundane security incidents all the time. Password issues, like we talked about with the SEC, access issues, misconfigurations, lack of documentation. And I said this to my team earlier today, and they kind of laughed at me. I said, security should be boring. And we had a chance to make this seemingly boring or seemingly obvious, awareness raising discussion something useful. And I don't think we did a good job of that. I actually saw there was a nuclear breach last week and somebody used the phrase cyber Chernobyl, and my head wanted to fully spin around on my neck. We need to pick a side, right? Are we doing awareness raising and helping everyone to get on board, or are we waiting for the cyber Pearl Harbor or the cyber 9/11? Because we can't have both. And I think we missed the mark on this. Like I said, good, bad, and ugly. And there's all this push for security by design. We have the PLC coding best practices, and that is security by default. And a lot of that is still ignored today. So we had an opportunity to just say, hey, we have a couple of tools and resources to avoid these scenarios. Yes, it's almost so bad that it's laughable, but it's not laughable because it could have an impact. And also we should celebrate that this organization was able to do manual operations, because I know of a lot of organizations that manual operations would break down in about 20 minutes if they had to do them today. So again, good, bad, and ugly. There were successes and there were failures, and we had a chance to celebrate and promote some things. And I think we totally missed the mark across the board.
Yeah, and the we is kind of funny on that. Yeah. Certainly the press likes that story. But we see a lot in the community hyping it up as well. I want to talk about that in a second, but to me, you gave that long list. The real issue here was this thing was on the internet. And I mean, if you have an insecure by design device attached to the internet, it's going to be compromised. So if you wanted to say, what is the lesson of this? Well, get your stuff off the internet was a clear lesson of this. But I think the other lesson you hit on, and this is really big. I wish we'd get this messaging out more. There's hundreds of thousands. I think there's like 150,000 water utilities or water providers in the United States alone. Different countries are arranged different ways. Mm-hmm. If you're a small or medium water utility and you just you have like an IT staff of 2 that handles the VP's laptop, the mail server, and the water treatment SCADA system, or, it's probably not even a SCADA. It's probably just like a bunch of PLCs and a couple of HMIs and engineering workstations. The odds of you doing that right are almost 0. And you just need to, I think, small utilities, and they did a great job here, as you said, you need to say this automation is nice, but not necessary. And we can continue to run safely and deliver our product to our customers. And even if there's a short-term outage within an appropriate amount of time, even if we lose our automation, I think you have to be really careful about moving to a level of automation that is necessary. until you're willing to commit the resources to do it right. And these small waters, like this example, or there was one actually that came out, it was in Ireland, Eris, Ireland, ERRIS. I had the numbers here. They had 180 customers, and they were hit with us from the same organization. And they were without water for 2 days, which tells me they were not able to operate manually, or maybe they took out a PLC and they didn't have that code backed up. So they could, they had to dig around or reprogram that thing to figure it out. So to me, that's the other clear lessons is if you're not big enough to do automation right, then you should be assuming that your automation is a nice to have.
Yeah, or if you're, so there's the other thing that we need to reconsider, and it might be a little spicy, but security has an ego problem, and we tend to, brush off these types of incidents and say you should have known better. But like you said, they don't know, and so things like the PLC top 20 considerations. If you're going to adopt automation, regardless, what are the resources that you can use that aren't, multi-million-dollar software licenses that can help you with these things? I'm sure, I don't know which number it is, but I'm sure disconnecting from the internet is one of the top of these best practices, and that's security by default if it's not by design. But expecting people to know that and get it right every time is laughable. And we're going to see more of this, right? With 5G, with telecommunication changes, with cloud adoption. BES in the cloud was a paper that NERC put out. All of these things, it's not going to go away. And we have to remember that security is a part of the business, right? It doesn't drive the business. And that's something we forget constantly. We have to be able to help others and reach out and explain things. And that's one of them, right? Again, I won't say which show or which company, but I was at a SCADA show here a conference here in Texas, and we had a local water utility talking about an upgrade that they did and all of the systems that they changed over, and there was no interruption to service and anything like that. And they mentioned the manufacturer, and they mentioned the entire process, and they said, we chose to go with an air-gapped network because we're more comfortable with that. Did I want to scream? Of course. Is that the best reaction? No. Knowing that there was no backup, I joked with my partner who suggested we buy a house there, and I said, maybe not. But other than that, there's a conversation to be had, right? There's a lot of work to be done, and we can't have that ego around security that I think does come through in some of the coverage.
Yeah, Rod Locke's comment about the missed impacts, because there was no impact in Aliquippa to the customers. Now, there might have been some financial loss internally because they have to send manual people out there, but probably not a large impact. Whereas the same week, and I actually put this in my Friday news and notes, a bunch of Texas hospitals were hit with ransomware, and it caused their emergency room systems to shut down. Rod mentions dialysis machines that weren't available, but also there's clear data. Josh Corman has the stats on this, that if you delay emergency services by an hour, the death rate increases this amount.
Yeah.
So those are the ones that I could see. Yes, we should have stories on those. This Aliquippa water reminded me, I don't know if you were in this industry at that time, but 10 years ago in 2013, we had the Bowman Avenue Dam hack, which actually ended up being a sluice gate that just, and it was dry. The gate was used like twice a year. It was on every major newspaper. Yeah. And sadly enough, it is still in many presentations, as this is why you need to do cybersecurity. And to me, when I see people put things like Aliquippa in their presentations, it immediately discredits them or lowers my view of what they're doing. I must admit.
The what ifs.
I'll give them a thorn and a rose. I mean, I got, I think I saw it in social, Dragos is having a webinar on Aliquippa. And I was like, oh, come on. Now they also are giving away free services to small utilities. So that's the good side. They're trying to help the problem, but we just got to stop going crazy on these things and just hyping them up, because then when things really matter, we're just not going to be believed. So I'll get off my soapbox. I'll give you the last word on this.
There was probably a worst case scenario there that, again, could be advantageous for awareness raising. Like I was saying, there's an opportunity here to change the discussion and have more public awareness. It almost seems like, short of this Cyber 9/11, it's all bandwagoning, and it almost seems like there's a contingent out there that wishes something worse would have happened, and that should definitely not be the case for our industry. So if that's you, let's all have a reality check. I think what was really interesting from Rod's comment here is he said the big difference this time is that someone felt they had a reason to attack them. Well, there's always a reason behind, right, your threat actors, but I think we really need to change the conversation around not mishaps, not overhyping incidents, but there's this whole, pushback of like, well, nobody would target me. I'm not the Iranian nuclear facility. I'm not a part of this war. I'm not using, Israeli components. That's not the conversation. The conversation that needs to happen is, what are the impacts going to be here? I know that, this is what my research is all about, but independent research, but at the end of the day, we need to help people move away from this conversation of likelihood of being the next target to understanding how to avoid worst case scenarios. And there are positive lessons learned from this incident in Pennsylvania that actually underscore that. And there's negative lessons learned from other reactions to incidents and things that could be worse. But we need to stop waiting for the worst and the worst and the worst case to do things better and to spread more awareness. So if Dragos does that, that's great. But back to this, reason to attack them. We don't need to know the reason to know the impacts and to know what's going to happen and to know which communities would be, impacted because of a greater reliance on these components or a greater distance from an alternative, right? Those are the kinds of conversations we need to be having as communities. And that's a huge missing piece from government relations. It's missing from the industry. It's missing from the market. It's missing from everything, right? How do we build better resilience across multiple sectors, across multiple targets, right? If I were to make a target list today in Texas, I might know how to do that. But are we having that conversation? Rarely.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying there, and obviously because I selected that topic for a talk for S4, so we're looking forward to hear more about that on stage. I think whether we look at Aliquippa or Oldsmar, I think you could look at these as a small utility or a small manufacturer, or a small chemical company, and you can use this as a near miss case. So Oldsmar, the case was, well, if someone tried to dump a bunch of chemicals in my system, would I detect that if my automation was completely owned? And
right.
we had a good talk on this, and if they had a pH sensor that was linked to the pump that couldn't be hacked, then the answer would be no. They
right.
couldn't do anything. In this
those
case,
interlocks. Yeah.
Yep. Well, not interlocks in the PLC, because those could be reprogrammed.
Mm-hmm. You mean in the monitoring of the actual system?
Yeah. So if they put the PLC, or if they put the pH sensor connected to the PLC, and the PLC would send the command to shut off the pump, that could be hacked. If they did it directly, then they'd be fine. Or in this case with Aliquippa, if our system gets compromised, how long before we can deliver water?
Yeah.
The answer there was, at least in this case, immediately. The answer in Eris was 2 days. 2 days probably isn't acceptable for most executives in a water utility.
I would agree with that. Yeah. What does that look like? What does redundancy look like and resilience? We tend to put those together, but systematically they're very different. Redundancy, obviously having a backup system, and resilience being your time to recover, right? Mean time to recover. So yeah, those metrics, I think those have gone away too. Yeah. Back to security should be boring. Those metrics matter, right? How many times you want to have that conversation? Probably not over and over again, but it's super important.
Well, that's a good segue. Let's get to wins, fails, and predictions. And since you mentioned metrics, I'll go first with my win. I've written about this. I've covered it. It's been in my podcasts and articles lately. But I just have to say, my win for this quarter is CISA put out some metrics. They weren't a lot. I think they can do a lot more, but you have to start somewhere. And I want to say that is a win to actually see them put out some metrics related to their vulnerability scanning service and the reduction in KEVs in the entity's internet accessible, known exploitable vulnerabilities, KEVs. I thought that was great to see that data. I'd also give a win to the ICS Security Apprenticeship Program that the ICS Village, Sands, and Siemens Energy put out. So some good things. What's your win for this?
Okay, it's going to be a little controversial, and I do think it was technically September 30th, but hopefully you'll let me have a pass. And that was the EPA eliminating the requirement for cybersecurity into their sanitary surveys. Not a win because it failed, but a win because industry still has a voice in these conversations. And because as an industry in the security side, we continue to say, don't bolt on security. And then we were seeing bolt on security. So whether or not the EPA has jurisdiction, I'm not, saying that it's a win because it said that. That's not true. They definitely have jurisdiction here. They have the right to do what they need to do. And you see a lot of organizations coming forward, including the 3 industry organizations that pushed back against this, saying we want to be involved actively and producing better baseline requirements for this industry. We just don't think this was the right place to have them. And I think EPA's understanding of that and pulling back and saying we'll work on this in the future was a win across the board. So it's a controversial kind of backhanded win, but I think it is a win.
Well, it certainly was better than the way it was done with pipelines, right? Where they put out the rules and then got the feedback.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And changed. So at least they did it in the right order.
Do I think it required a lawsuit? Maybe not. Did the lawsuit help? Probably. But that stuff is outside of my scope of knowledge. But I think the lawsuit's arguments went a little too far. EPA is a sector risk management agency, and they need best practices across the board. I think this Pennsylvania incident highlights that perfectly. Again, that awareness, that training, and that kind of community-oriented approach is what we need.
Okay, and your fail for Q4?
Okay, my fail is also one I hate to say, but I was comparing the NIST 800-82 revision 3 to the CSF 2.0. And we waited, I think, a little over a year for the revision to come out for the 800-82 document. And it comes out just before the new NIST CSF updates, but it actually goes through section by section for the functions of the old NIST CSF framework. And I would have waited a little longer for those to just be congruent. I love the NIST 800-82 document. I think it's an amazing technical resource for organizations across the board. It's vendor agnostic. It's everything we need it to be. However, I did go map recently the functions in it and the update proposed for the 2.0, and they are different enough that I think it could have warranted, since it's from the exact same organization, a perfect overlap for the next 10 years or however long this CSF is going to be reigning. So I hate to call it a fail. Again, it's an incredible piece of work, but I just would have wished that those aligned a little bit closer.
No, I think that's fair, especially since this version of the CSF has the govern function.
Exactly.
So it's not just a tweak. It's a pretty significant.
Yeah. And that might be where budgets
total reorganization, but not a small change.
Yeah, and they made it the first one, and it's a lot of where those budget conversations and those shareholder conversations are going to start on that govern function now, and I just think it is pretty crucial. So,
well, hopefully NIST can. The problem with these standards is it's so hard to make updates quickly. So hopefully it won't be another year before we get that rev just to align them. But that's a good call out. I'd have to agree with you.
Great work.
My fail. It's funny. CISA puts out so much stuff that I could do CISA only on all this stuff. Like their Shields Ready program to me is a complete fail. We've now got Shields up and now they're ready and who knows what's next. But my fail for the quarter is IronNet. They went from a $1.2 billion valuation in 2021 to bankrupt. And not that kind of nice bankruptcy where you go into chapter 7 or chapter 11 and reemerge, but basically in such bad shape that they got all their assets sold for $35 million and they're just done. And to me, I don't know who gets a failure for that. The people that valued them at 1.2 million or 1.2 billion, that's probably who deserves a failure on this. I know not all startups are going to make it, but that kind of fall just shows that people weren't looking at this properly. And I guess it's a warning that things can happen that fast if the valuation is based on a story rather than on numbers.
Yeah, or on logos, right? Who your actual customer base is. I call that the scorched earth policy. It didn't turn out well for them, but I do wish those folks luck. I think there's a lot of great people that came out of it, so the job market's benefiting.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Okay,
let's go to your prediction. What's your prediction for? And let's say this can be for any time in 2024. So hopefully it's not longer than that.
No, I have the most boring prediction. I think everything old is new, especially when it comes to OT and ICS. I think the push around conversations on AI and ML are great. However, I think we're forgetting a lot of the things that we thought about 3 or 4 years ago that haven't really come to fruition. I already mentioned it, and that is 5G networks and telcos, as we see telcos being targeted increasingly by adversaries, as well as cloud adoption across potentially energy as a first step, but other organizations. I think we're all going to remember things that we predicted a couple of years ago, seeing in the next year or so as those deployments actually start to take hold. And it's not that AI and ML aren't important, but I actually heard somebody recently say, well, is zero trust dead because now it's all about AI? We have to stop following the headlines, right? We need to really understand where we've put our chips and why.
So what's the prediction? I lost that there. I
That
understood
we'll
the
see more
theme, but
incidents across the board in 5G deployments, telcos, and cloud-based solutions
okay.
across
Okay.
automation. Yeah.
That's a solid prediction. We'll see how it comes out in
Well, I
2024.
don't hope so, but I don't want to be right. You know?
No, but you're looking at the data.
Yeah.
Mine is, I believe, in the first 6 months. So I'll cut my time frame to 6 months. In the first 6 months, we will see one or more vendors in the OT detection space, OT detection / asset inventory space, integrate SBOMs.
Really? I thought you were going to
I think
say.
that you will see now how far along they actually are on that. I won't know, but the press releases will be out, the capabilities will be out, and my expectation is it will be more on the cloud side of their offerings than on their on-prem side. So I think that they'll be able to import those sorts of things.
I might bet against you on that one. I'm not sure.
Well, we'll see. I mean, you
Yeah.
you probably have inside information, so I don't want to get you in trouble, but I think someone's going to do it just because I think you're going to see CRA and is going to push SBOMs, and there's a lot of push of SBOMs in the U.S. government. And,
Yeah, definitely.
And I don't think it's that hard, really. I think they might not necessarily bring the data in, but actually be able to pull the data from a third-party source. So you see partnerships.
But is it
so that's
useful
my
for their
prediction.
strategy? We'll see. That's the thing.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the show, Daniel. Danielle, we went almost a full hour here, so we got to get off. But I hope you have a happy holiday, and I hope all our watchers and listeners out there have a good end of the year, and we will see you again in 2024. So thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Dale. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to S4 this year. It's going to be a party. Next year.
Yes, it will. Bye, everyone.